The order is simple, and every man who hears it understands exactly what it means. It is January 1945, in a German prisoner of war camp deep inside the collapsing Reich, and the commandant has just informed the captured American soldiers that the next morning only the Jewish prisoners are to fall out. Just the Jews. Step forward and be counted, and every freezing, starving man in that camp knows what it means to be a Jew pulled out of line by the Nazis in the last winter of the war. It is a sentence of death, or of something worse than death. The order lands hardest on one man, the senior American in the camp, because it is his job to make the prisoners obey. And in the instant he hears it, he decides he is going to do the exact opposite, whatever it costs him. He understood precisely what he was refusing. By 1945, the shape of the Nazi genocide was known to the men fighting the war, and a Jewish soldier captured in an American uniform stood in terrible danger, supposedly protected as a prisoner of war, but in reality liable to be separated out, shipped to a slave labor camp, and murdered. Among the more than 1,000 American prisoners in this camp were a number of Jewish soldiers. The order to single them out was, whatever polite words the commandant used for it, an order to hand those men over to die. The sergeant was not going to give that order to his men. He had a different one in mind. That night, word moved quietly through the camp. The Jewish soldiers understood what the morning could bring, and some of them, by later accounts, were quietly told to lose their dog tags, the small metal tags that recorded a man's religion, so that they could not be picked out. It was a long night in the cold, a night of men lying awake, wondering whether they would be alive by evening, while their sergeant turned over in his mind the thing he had decided to do. So the next morning, when the command came to assemble, he did not send the Jewish soldiers forward. He ordered every American in the camp to fall out, all of them, more than 1,000 men, standing together in the snow. The commandant came out expecting a small group, and found instead the entire body of American prisoners lined up in front of him, and he was furious. He rounded on the sergeant and demanded to know the meaning of it. "They cannot all be Jews," he said. The sergeant looked him in the eye and gave the answer that would follow him for the rest of his life. His name was Roddie Edmonds, a master sergeant from Knoxville, Tennessee, and what he said was this: "We are all Jews here. Everything about this is documented. In the sworn who stood in that snow and lived because of him. He was real. It is one of the bravest things any American did in the whole war. And for 60 years, almost no one knew it had happened at all." Before we go further, if stories like this one matter to you, please take a moment to subscribe. It genuinely helps us keep the memory of these men alive and reach more people who care about them. Thank you. Now, back to that frozen morning and to the sergeant standing between 1,000 men and a furious commandant. The commandant was not a man accustomed to being defied, and he did not intend to allow it. He drew his pistol and pressed it against Roddie among the prisoners. He would shoot him where he stood. Edmonds did not move and did not look away. He told the commandant that under the Geneva Convention, a prisoner was required to give only Geneva Convention, his rank, and his all he would ever, and then he said, and his serial number, and this was all he would ever give. And then he said, the thing that turned the whole moment. He told the commandant the truth about the war. Germany was losing, he said, and it was almost over, and when it ended, there would be a reckoning. "If you shoot me," Edmonds told him, "you will have to shoot all of us, and you will be tried and hanged for it." It was a threat built entirely out of fact. The commandant stood there with the pistol to the sergeant's head and did the arithmetic, and he understood that Edmonds was right, that slaughtering 1,000 American prisoners in the final months of a lost war would put the noose around his own neck. He lowered the pistol. He turned and walked away. And roughly 200 Jewish American soldiers in that camp lived because one man would not point them out. That, for a long moment after the commandant lowered the pistol and walked away, the American prisoners simply stood there in the snow, more than 1,000 of them, holding the formation, barely able to believe what they had just seen. They had watched their senior sergeant stake every one of their lives on a single refusal, and they had watched it work. The Jewish soldiers, among them who had spent the night, wondering if they would be dragged out and killed, were still standing in the ranks with everyone else, anonymous and safe, exactly as Edmonds had made them. No one had been given up. The line had held, not with weapons, but with one man's refusal to obey. Roddie Edmonds was not a career officer or a famous man. He was an ordinary American from Tennessee, drafted and sent to Europe, and he had been captured in the chaos of the Battle of the Bulge, the massive German counterattack of December 1944 that overran and cut off thousands of American troops in the frozen forests. As the senior, non-commissioned officer in the frozen forests, the Menenenkot Wiswunhone the prisoners, and he carried that his responsibility on one January morning further than almost any man ever has. What he did is simple to describe and almost impossible to imagine doing. With a loaded pistol against his head, entirely in the power of an enemy who could have killed him on the spot without consequence, he refused to surrender the men in his charge, and he staked his own life on it instantly, without hesitation, and without any guarantee it would work. He did not know the commandant would back down. He could not have known. He simply decided that he would die before he would give up a single one of his men, and he made that decision in the space of a single breath. The men never forgot it, and it is because of them that we know it at all. Decades later, the soldiers who had stood in that camp gave their accounts, and they matched. One of them, a Jewish soldier named Paul Stern, had been close enough that morning to hear every word, and he carried the memory of exactly what Edmonds said, and what it cost him to say it, for the rest of his life. These are not second-hand legends. They are the sworn memories of men who had been within feet of the pistol, who knew that they had lived their whole long lives, only because Roddie Edmonds had refused to move. And then, having done it, he never spoke of it. The war ended, the prisoners were freed, and Roddie Edmonds went home to Tennessee and lived an ordinary life, raised a family, worked, grew older, and never told them what he had done in that camp. He kept 2 small diaries from his captivity and put them away in a drawer. He died in 80 down. Kelly, the Nazi commandant, he faced down a Nazi commandant to save 200 men, very nearly died with him. And then it was his son, Chris, a pastor, who found it. Years after his father was gone, going through the old diaries and then following the thread, he slowly pieced together what his quiet father had actually done in the war. And he found the survivors, old men now, who had stood in that camp. One of them said he had lived his entire life because an American sergeant he barely knew had refused to give him up tour. To die, the son had never heard a word of it. His father had carried the whole thing in silence to his grave. The trail his son followed was thin and almost accidental. Chris Edmonds began with his father's 2 worn diaries, which gave names and dates but not the whole story. And then, digging through old records, he stumbled onto a passing mention of his father in a newspaper, and from there onto the survivors themselves. One by one, the old men filled in what the diaries left out, until the shape of that January morning finally came clear, 60 years on, to a son who had loved his father all his life and never once suspected what the quiet man had done. In 2015, 70 years after that morning in the snow, Roddie Edmonds was named Righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem, the highest honor given to those who risked their own lives to save Jews from the Nazis. He was the first American serviceman ever to receive it. The recognition came far too late for him to see it, but it came, and at last his name was spoken aloud, beside what he had done. When the honor finally came, in a ceremony in 2015, the men who had been saved and the children and grandchildren of men who had been saved were there to see Roddie Edmonds recognized at last. The arithmetic of a single act of courage forward through generations. 200 men lived that morning because of him, who odor of people walking the accounted. The number existence to 4 words today, or jaw so sit words, a sergeant said in the snow, cannot be counted. There is a kind of courage that performs for no audience, that seeks nothing, that is never meant to be seen. Roddie Edmonds had it. He stood between his men and a loaded pistol, saved 200 lives with 4 words and a cold, unshakable nerve, and then went home and told no one, because to him it was not a story to tell. It was simply what a man was supposed to do when the moment came. We are all Jews here, he said it once, in the snow, to a man who could have killed him for it, and then he let it go and lived quietly for 40 more years. The men he saved never forgot it. It is right that at last the rest of us know it too.